All right, hello everyone. My name is Claire Wrenwood, and I am reading a story tonight called The River. I'm excited to share this with you all. I know that some of you have heard kind of the beginning of it or various iterations of it, so I'm excited to share the full version. So, The River. In the beginning, the river was wild. It flooded the town, which was in those days a mere settlement, a clump of houses braced against the terrors of the world. Every week, it carried off innocent men as they screamed in vain. So the men of the town, desperate, paid a visit to the troll. The river must be tamed, the troll said, for in those days, my child, trolls could talk. How? The men said. For the taming, the troll said, I will need a bridge. For the bridge, I will need blood. Whose blood? The men asked, thinking of their horses, their dogs. How much? A woman's, the troll said. All of it. And the men despaired. The sheriff, on returning home that night, told his wife of what had passed. Why, then I shall do it, she said, and held fast against his protests. And so the troll seized her and drank of her blood. When it had finished, it hooked one of her thigh bones into the clinking skirt at its waist and cast the rest into the river. Up sprang a bridge, and the sheriff wept, for in its graceful lines he saw his wife's image and knew her soul lay within. The river receded. The town was safe. For a while. Anyhow. At this point in the story, Bailey's father always reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 drumsticks he had saved from dinner, and began knocking them together. The troll still lives beneath the bridges of this town, protecting us from the river. So beware, little one. Do what you shouldn't. Wander too far, and you might hear the tap-tapping of the troll's skirt. Faster, 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 so until the troll... At these words, he would plunge his face into her stomach and blow raspberries until Bailey wriggled and shrieked. Will you be good? He would ask, his face still buried in her blankets. Will you be a good girl? Yes, she would laugh. Yes. Only then would he release her. Bailey's mother hated the troll story. I don't buy it, she said. What kind of a woman volunteers to die? Bailey, sulking because her mother hadn't brought the drumsticks, or done the voices, or paused dramatically at the right moments, said, maybe she was a better mother. Maybe the men just needed an excuse. An excuse to do what? Bailey asked. But her mother was already halfway out the door. Her mother was always halfway out the door. But that was all kid stuff. Bailey was older. She knew the truth. The troll and its bridges were real enough. But people did bad things all the time and never got eaten for it. Take her father. Take Bailey, who just last week had let Eric lay her on the riverbank and tug down her underwear and come inside of her in a hot, wet rush. And she was still here, which was more than her mother could say. Gone to the river. That was what they called it when a woman went the way of that first sheriff's wife. Bailey understood how the world worked now. You were safe only as long as you were loved. And so she had allowed the sheriff's son to woo her. She had kept her grades up and gone to church and eaten lunch with the right girls. When she walked down Main Street, her hand cupped in Eric's, the townspeople turned to each other and said, look how well she's turned out, in spite of everything. Now her class had chosen her, of all the girls in the 10th grade, to hold the River Queen's crown at this year's festival. And she would, if only her father would wake up. She stood over him, watching the afternoon sun stream through the living room windows and turn his bald patch a satisfying red. Pancakes in the kitchen, she said. He did not stir. She prodded his calf with her foot. Festival's starting soon. I have to be there early, remember? He started awake and glared at her, his eyes wild and red-rimmed like a rooster's. Fuck the festival to fucking Sunday, he said. It is Sunday, Bailey said. He ignored her, hauling himself from the couch just as Darlene shuffled out of the bedroom, wearing a bathrobe that had belonged to Bailey's mother. Whenever Bailey thought of her mother and Darlene, her throat tightened so she could hardly breathe. In those moments, she would look at Darlene's hands, which were stout and wrinkled. See? Bailey would think to herself, triumphant. Even when she became a soft, doleful woman who cried at all the wrong moments, her mother's hands stayed beautiful. The fingers tapering to slender points, the nails long and perfectly oval. At the table, Darlene eyed Bailey. I hear you're carrying the crown. Bailey nodded. Last year, it was Tamarin Rice who carried the crown, and now she's River Queen. That what you want? Maybe, Bailey said. We'll see. This was untrue. Bailey would not wait and see. Next year, when she was eligible, she would campaign for the River Queen's crown and she would get it. She knew she would. She had to. Didn't do her any good, Darlene muttered. Who? Bailey said. Her father was glaring at Darlene. Bailey looked between the two of them. Mom? Are you talking about Mom? She wasn't talking about a damn thing. Her father's voice was a sharp object. Right? Mom was never River Queen, Bailey said. She hated the festival, all the old tales. You heard wrong, Darlene said, glancing at Bailey's father. Her knife and fork trembled in her hands, and she set them against her plate with a clatter. I never said a word. Anyway, Bailey said, she would have told me before she left Bailey to fend for herself in this hard, sad world. You want to get to the festival, don't you? Her father got up from the table. Do the dishes and we'll walk over. At the kitchen sink, Bailey attacked a pan with steel wool. They're wrong, she thought. She would have told me. She would have... A flash in the corner of her vision. Bailey looked out the window and into the yard, where a cardinal had landed on a dying crabapple in what had once been her mother's garden. Then her gaze traveled, unwillingly, down the sloping, pitted lawn, to the river, to the bridge that had sprung up over it a year ago. Her mother's bridge was a stately suspension bridge, its cable railing swooping like inverted rainbows. It looked as though she had been caught mid-stride, one foot planted this side of town and the other going, Where? Bailey had whispered the day it came up, as she watched the sheriff board up its entrance, his hammer ringing through the yard like a bell. Where were you going? After the sheriff left, she had run into her mother's garden and dug up every bulb, every flower, every bush, spooning dirt from the holes, digging down until earth became clay, searching for some clue of her mother's intent. But all she found were a few scraps of decomposing paper, brown and soft as leaves. Bailey's hands had gone still in the soapy water. She tried to swallow and found she could not. Her mother's absence lay upon her like a bruise. Or not a bruise, something worse, something that devoured from within. If someone prodded her, she would split in two, her emotions howling onto the floor in a foul slurry. She slammed the pan against her thumb and was rewarded with pain. She would not make her mother's mistakes. Next year, she would stand before the town and wave like the Queen of England, and Eric would wink at her from the crowd, and nothing in the world could hurt her. Not the river, or the troll, or the thought of becoming just another bridge. Bailey pulled the cord on the blinds. They descended with a jerk. At the festival, someone grabbed Bailey from behind and pressed their crotch against her until she felt the hardness there. See what you do to me? Eric whispered in her ear. Bailey pretended to strain against his arms. "Stop it," she giggled. He tightened his grip. "I can't stop thinking about last week, down by the river." "Someone will see," Bailey said primly, but she felt a corresponding thrill of desire. "I hope they see," Eric said. "I hope they see you're mine." "Anyway, I can't. I'm crowning the River Queen, remember?" Eric released her with a sound of disgust. "I don't get why you care about that stupid thing." "It's all very well for you," Bailey wanted to say. "You're the sheriff's son. You're the town's golden boy." Instead, she rubbed against him and whispered, "Find me after, okay? I'll give you something to think about." Blowing him a kiss over her shoulder, she sauntered away. "Always leave him wanting more," Darlene had counseled, back in the days when she was still trying to win Bailey over with her clumsy facsimile of motherly advice. Bailey had absorbed more of it than she would ever admit. Everett Miller and Tamron Rice, the River King and Queen, were seated on a small dais at the front of the crowd. Bailey scrambled up beside them, peering out nervously at the better part of the town. A minute later, the sheriff stumped onto the platform and, after a short struggle with the microphone, launched into his usual speech. "In the beginning," he said, "the river was wild. It flooded the town, which was in those days a mere settlement, a clump of houses braced against the terrors of the world. Every week, it carried off innocent men as they screamed in vain." Bailey suppressed a yawn. Between the sheriff and her father, she knew this story by heart. She looked down at the crown, heavy and finely wrought. Her thumb rubbed against some roughness on its interior. She tilted it to look. Engraved on the band were names, each year's River Queen. Bailey skimmed a finger along them idly, half listening to the sheriff's voice drone on. Then she stopped. Valerie Dodson, her mother's maiden name. "And so the troll seized her and drank of her blood." Her mother's name was crossed out. Scattered across the band, other names were too. Bailey remembered what Darlene had said. Didn't do her any good. She felt faint. Her mother had been River Queen. She had stood on the stage and received the love of all assembled, and none of it had been enough. The sheriff's voice had stopped. He was looking at her. The whole town was looking at her. Bailey stepped forward and lifted the crown and looked out at the river's broad sweep. Up and down its length were bridges, strung like necklaces on a woman's long neck. She saw the bridge of Eric's mother, of a former classmate, of old Mrs. Walter, who had taught her piano for one reluctant season, of an usher at the church, of a clerk at the drugstore, all pointing in the same direction, all asking her the same thing. "Little girl, did you think yourself so different?" Hands trembling, Bailey lowered the crown onto Tamron Rice's shining head. In the beginning, the river drove women mad. They ran through the town wailing, naked, dripping, bruises the size of men's fists blooming on their skin. The troll saw their sickness and said, "It is the river water that taints their souls and drives them to madness. Do not let them near it." So the men built a railing along the river. They boarded up each new bridge. They warned the women from the river, and the women, for the most part, obeyed. But sometimes they did not. Sometimes, a woman scaled the railing and let the river's dark waters turn her mad. This left her man with no choice but to go out into the night, shaking his head in sorrow, and call upon the troll. "She's got the river in her," Bailey's father had said that last night. He was staring at the front door, which her mother had slammed on her way out. They had argued like always, but this time had been different. This time, her mother had refused to stop. "Lying cheat," she had screamed over and over. "Crazy bitch," he had said, So many times and with such conviction that Bailey had started to believe him. He set his cap on his head and went out into the night. A week later, Darlene moved in. The ceremony had ended. Bailey stumbled off the platform. Eric came up to her, but she pushed past him. Panic constricted her chest and narrowed her vision as she lurched through the crowd, tripping over coolers and toddlers gone rogue. She found her father lounging with Darlene on an old army blanket her mother had bought at Goodwill, the cooler of beer beside him mostly empty. "Why didn't you tell me?" she panted. He grinned up at her. He had taken pills again, his pupils 2 pinpricks in an endless blue. "My Bailey bird," he said, "going cheap, cheap, cheap." Darlene laughed. "Why didn't you tell me Mom was River Queen?" Her voice was too loud. People on surrounding blankets were looking up and around, whispering. Her decorous reputation was crumbling with every angry word. She did not care. "I ruined everything," her father said, and she realized how far gone he was, for he was about to cry, right here in the park. His voice cracked. "I wanted you to have something all your own." "Your daddy's a good man," Darlene said. He had pressed one cheek against the blanket and was muttering into it, tears cresting his nose and spattering against the wool. Bailey watched him weep. How could someone so pitiful cause so much pain? She felt wild, unmoored. Everything she had known to be true in her life was falling away beneath her feet. So she turned. She ran, past the picnicking families, along Main Street with its shuttered buildings, through the old part of town with its decrepit colonials, down the long gravel road that led towards home. Only when she rounded the side of her house did she realize where her feet were taking her. For the past year, she had avoided even looking at her mother's bridge. Now she scaled the boards blocking its entrance and jumped onto it. Never in her life had she been this close to the river. She could hear its rush below her feet. She stood there, half expecting the troll to appear and stop her. Nothing happened. She kicked a cable. She felt empty, hollowed out, as though someone had scraped away her insides with a spoon. The only thing left was a lack, a longing. She glanced at the patch of dirt where her mother's garden had grown and remembered the time her mother had shown her what lay beneath. They had been planting tulip bulbs. Looking around, her mother had taken a piece of paper out of her pocket, unfolded it, and handed it to Bailey. It was jagged-edged, as though ripped from a diary. Bailey had been young, barely school age. The only words she could make out were, "I want, I want, I want," written over and over again in her mother's looping, childish hand. "See," her mother had said, taking the page and lining the hole with it, helping Bailey cover it with dirt. "Like this." Bailey's throat ached. "Why didn't you tell me you were River Queen?" she whispered to the bridge. It gave no reply, but she knew the answer. "Because I couldn't bear to take that away from you, too." A figure emerged from around the side of the house. Bailey tensed, then relaxed. It was only Eric. He ran down to the bridge, grinning. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. But he swung over the barrier and joined her at the railing, wrapping his arms around her. They stood like this a long time, listening to the sound of the river. At last he said, "You miss her?" "Yes," she said, surprised. "I miss mine too." He never talked about his mother. "Really?" she said. Against her head, his chin ducked in a nod. "I sneak out every Sunday morning to leave flowers on her bridge. I think my dad knows, but he doesn't say anything." "I didn't know that." "There's a lot we don't know about each other. But we have so many years ahead of us. Did you know that, Bailey? I want you. Forever." He turned her to him and kissed her passionately. Bailey returned the kiss, but she could not help wondering if her father had ever said the same to her mother. If forever didn't always work out the way you planned. Urgency crept into Eric's breathing, into the press of his body against hers. His hands explored, insisted, bypassed fabric and buttons. One slid up her shirt. The other slipped inside her shorts, then her underwear. His fingers dipped inside of her and he moaned. She was wet without meaning to be, her body responding to his touch, even as her mind held back. He circled her clit, and desire bloomed in her belly. So did a sense of wrongness. "I can't," she said, pulling away. His hands paused. "Why not?" "Not on her bridge." "It's not like she'll care. She's already dead." Bailey took his hand out of her pants. "I think I'll go back now." "Hey," he murmured. "Hey, look, I said that wrong." Teasingly, he grasped her wrists and kissed her neck. But I bet I could make you want to." She jerked his hands away. "Stop it." "You said you would. Earlier, you said you would." "I changed my mind." "Come on." He put his arms around her, but she shrugged out of his grasp. "I said stop it." He was staring at her, panting, desire and cruelty tugging at his open mouth, as though he wanted to kiss her and slap her all at once. "You're the one who's a tease, rubbing yourself all over me at the park." "But that was what you wanted," Bailey said, feeling trapped. "That was just flirting, playing games." "I know a game," Eric said. He unzipped his pants. Don't make me call up the troll now," he murmured, so softly that for a moment she thought she had not heard right. Her mouth was dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You're starting to sound a lot like your mom. You been swimming in the river too?" "You know I've never touched the river." "That's not what they'll say when your bridge comes up. They'll say you went for a swim just like she did. They'll say it turned you mad." "You wouldn't dare," Bailey said, but her voice quavered. The cruelty in Eric's face had passed. He rubbed her shoulders and smiled. "I know you, Bailey. You're not like her. You don't want to go the same way she did." Bailey thought of her mother's pages, buried in the garden and turned now to dust. And for what? She had still become a bridge, in the end. "You're right," she said. "I'm not like her." Tearing herself from Eric's grasp, she took a few steps back, towards the other end of the bridge. "I won't go the way she did." In the beginning, the river stayed in its rightful place. But that was in the beginning. Now the river swelled and spread. Stories came from up and down its great length, of whole towns inundated, swallowed, never to be seen again. In the beginning, the river obeyed. Now it was rising, and no man could make it stop. Bailey turned and walked towards the other end of the bridge, waiting for the sound of Eric's footsteps. She heard nothing, until, as she started down the steps, he whistled a long, low note. She froze. There came another sound, one that sent a shiver from her head down to her toes. Clink, clink, clink. Bailey turned slowly to her left, knowing already what she would find. The troll. It had clambered up from the riverbank, and now it stood, watching her, the skirt of bones at its waist swaying like wind chimes. It stank of rotting meat and rust and something else she could not place. River silt, perhaps, or mold. Bailey could find no trace of the human in its elephantine skin, its great flat face. As she watched, its mouth, wide, lipless, cracked open to reveal row upon row of reddened teeth, blunt and solid as bricks. Whatever spirit had animated her body all her life fled. Bailey trembled, pinned like a fly beneath a thumb. The troll took a step towards her, and the ground shuddered. Movement rushed into her limbs, raw, animal fear. She stumbled back, her heels hitting the stairs. "Good girl," Eric said. "Back this way." Bailey had reached the middle of the bridge, where the top cable dipped to the height of her chest. Eric stood at the other end, waiting. "I'll look after you," he said, when she hesitated. "There's nothing to be afraid of as long as you're with me." A few hours ago, Bailey would have believed him. Now she thought of her father and the sheriff and wondered if their stories had any truth in them at all. What if those first drowned men had not been so innocent? What if the sheriff's wife had not volunteered to die? What if the river did not drive women mad? What if the only real story was the men and their anger and their troll? "Liar," she said, and she leapt onto the railing's lowest rung. "What are you doing?" Eric said. "Bailey, I can't call off the troll unless you come back." The troll had stepped onto the bridge, making the cables beneath Bailey's fingers buck and sway as she hoisted herself onto the next rung. "I was always going to call it off." There was fear in Eric's voice now. The bridge shuddered as the troll picked up speed. "Just come back. Come back to me." Bailey looked down at the swift, dark waters she had been warned from all her life and sensed, for the first time, the rage contained within. A rage that was building, rising, thickening with each passing day. A rage that would someday flood its banks and take and take and take. The troll was barreling towards her, stretching out one great hand. Bailey barely noticed as she mounted the final rung and tensed her knees. All this time, she had thought her mother's soul lay within a bridge. But she saw now why the sheriff boarded up each new bridge, why the men had kept them from the river for so long. They wanted no woman to know what she knew in that moment before she hit the water. The women were not the bridges. The bridges only pointed the way. The women were the river, and the river was wild. Thank you. Thanks, y'all.
We off the air?
No, any questions? How can people find you online?
ClaireWrenwood.com.